you. Your side has argued until now that there is some kind of complementarism between science and humanities, so they complement each other. From this, I gather that the motion in front of today's House has already failed. Am I right in thinking so?
No, I don't think you're right. Otherwise I wouldn't be arguing the case, of course. I think the motion in its most bleak form, okay, if you really push it to its extremes, clearly can't be true. But if you, which means the blurb that essentially was on the screen under the motion, I don't necessarily agree with, okay? Or whatever came around in the emails, so some of the other people told, I haven't seen the email, but the email announcement apparently was quite strongly worded. So I've got no problem with that. But essentially I don't agree with it as strongly as that. But what I'm really trying to say is that you can argue the case. Okay, there are elements where I think we objectively can say science makes a stronger impact than humanities. Now, you could, clearly, what the opposition is making is they're roughly equal. Now, it's for you to decide whether the balance is actually like that or like that. Okay, and sure, if you're sitting on this side, it should be like that, of course. But I'm really trying to argue there's enough small weights on our side of the balance that essentially it tips. But it's not an enormous block of concrete I can put on there, so it's sent to the lecture theatre below.
And I guess the analogy I would make is with university league tables. You can draw categories like proportion of firsts awarded, or whether the university concerned begins with an M, or number of Nobel Prize winners, or whatever. And then you can of course rank all of the universities like that, and then you can say, Manchester is better than Harvard because something, or you can say Harvard is better than Manchester, Parish's thought. But the idea is that you can make all these rankings, and I guess what both sides have been trying to do is to say, okay, well, this is better able than that to address such and such a question. But then how you weight the rankings is for you to decide, and that's how the Times does it, and that's how the Guardian does it, and as a result, then people go to one university or another. But that is the choice.
Can I come in? Yeah, I just want to add, when you're following the advice, which I think is very good advice, ask yourself the one question: when you have to decide, on what basis are you deciding? Values.
Common sense. Thank you.
Common sense, values.
Final question. Final question for the opposition. Yes, in the black.
Rory. Nice to watch you. Earlier on, you mentioned about the idea of different methods, and on your perspective, all these different methods, one wouldn't work so well for your subject, and that is the actual science method. This science method we've been using since degrees, and we have made significant progress in all fields, where all your fields, they seem to be based very heavily on what science can prove or disprove. So my question is, isn't it more efficient and effective to go forth on the science method rather than all your many methods which can be biased towards human influence?
Okay. Let me just first say that we haven't been using scientific methods that came from the Greeks. I think the modern scientific method is somewhere more like the 1700s. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere around there. But putting that aside, your point is that science has given us great advances. The arts and the humanities have left us just arguing around in circles, chasing our own tail, really. Now, I just think that's false. And I think that's false because we've seen huge advances in philosophy, in mathematics. Remember, mathematics is not necessarily understood only as a science. It's a conceptual thing. Logic, for example, formal logic is the basis upon which you have computer languages, which then enable you to have computers that work in the way that they do, and so on. So there are all sorts of things that have been going on in philosophy, which is my area rather than the humanities and such, which lead to huge advances. But even if it didn't lead to huge advances in the way that you think science has done, and I don't want to dispute that science has produced a lot of stuff, it has. There are other ways in which we can advance that don't follow that kind of trajectory. We evolve philosophically, we understand things better. As I gave the example of democracy earlier, we now have an idea that slavery is wrong, which we didn't have before. We hold on to the fact that there should be equality amongst the sexes, racism is bad. These things are all developing as we go along. In part, I might add, because science has shown us that there isn't any real difference between blacks and whites, men and women. Not significant, relevant differences. So science has helped us enormously, no doubt about it. But I've never argued that science was irrelevant. I'm saying science and the arts and philosophy and humanities all go together to make this rich world in which we understand. And that's how it should carry on. And to try and go one method, as we mentioned earlier, which was to try and use the scientific method in the social sciences, very, very quickly hit a wall and didn't produce any of the kinds of things that science produced. Because when you're dealing with human subjects, the way you study them has to be different from when you study the natural world or physical objects. In large part because human subjects can change their behavior in terms of the way in which you're observing them. So you can't do science in the same way. The variables change. But as my colleagues over there pointed out, analytical reasoning has always been used. All the kinds of things that we think are good, solid reasoning. I mean, philosophy is all about good, solid reasoning, about deductive logic, about inductive logic, about fallacies and so on. All that's always been there, and always it's still being used, but on topics that don't lend themselves in the same way that the physical world lends itself to science. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your questions. You all deserve a round of applause. Now we're going to move on to the summary speeches. Could the speakers kindly keep them to a maximum of 3 minutes? 2 minutes would be better. We run out of time.